and did something to certain parameters in our long-range data to where I might have engineered in a gap. In other words, maybe I went through all these thousands of words and never gave any word a temporal association out 5 years. If that were the case, then from 1997 I would have had a gap that would have gone out 5 years. From 2000, I would have had a gap that would have gone out to 5 years, and it would always have been 5 years ahead of me, and in essence would have been an artifact that would have always advanced away from me when I did the bot runs. I hope that makes sense. Instead, what I find is that the gap is narrowing closer to us the closer we get to that time frame. This is very unusual behavior, to say the least. So given the complexity of the programs that I'm working, there's still some possibility that it's an artifact in the programming. That's because I've got 200 or 300 executables that are involved in doing the analysis. So it is still conceivable that there is a ghosting data within the SQL Server temp library or temp DB structure or some damn thing that's causing the data gap. That aside, the data that we do have prior to the trail off on the gap suggests erratic solar activity, to say the least. It seems to be that just before the gap occurs, there's a spike in two areas within the Terra entity and within the Space Goat Farts entity relative to what we've always called the sun disease. Boy, I sure hope that makes sense. And then the sun disease also trails off with everything else, but that would seem to suggest CME or something like that that may hit us at an electronic level, such that what the data is actually indicating is a lack of communication ability rather than a lack of things or humans to do the communicating. End of statement.
A lot, Clif. You know, with the information that I have, you know, with the solar activity, and we've had many threads on the board with it knocking out the grid, you know, makes us wonder how far back and how primitive of a situation we might be in, and are we prepared for it?
That I can address very succinctly and statistically accurately in saying that no, we're not prepared for it. There's no transformer manufacturing facility in the United States. There's no transformer manufacturing facility in the planet now capable of replacing the number of transformers that we have in any grid anywhere on the planet in short order. If some place as highly electrified as Europe or the U.S. were to be under a CME when it arrived on Earth and we lost our power grid, the estimates that you'll hear from the propagandists are 18 months. The estimates I've been told from what we call our green sources, that is to say people who used to wear fatigues in my day, but these days are wearing camos, and who have been tasked with the idea of analyzing such a scenario, tell me 10 years. So 10 years before there's a national electrical grid again. And that's if things go well.
Is it possible that the data gap could be the result of events on the Earth that are, in the present times, inconceivable, so that the future dialogue wouldn't register given the lexicon as it exists at present? Or in other words, has it been so distorted that we are blind and have little concept of what we could really be?
That's a really good question, because that is a possibility. It is possible. We've always had this issue that came out the first time I ever dealt with George Euro on anything, because I had this tipping point spike. But by then, by that time, I think I'd only gotten to like M in the lexicon, so I was well away from the T word for terrorist. Otherwise, we would have been much more accurate. So it is quite conceivable that we simply don't have language to express what we're going to have to deal with. If that's the case, it's going to have to be some really woo-woo stuff, let me tell you, because we've got a lot of words out there.
Clif, there was a couple questions that popped up, but I think one thing that really that Nuke even pointed out that even crossed my mind as well, I'm sure with other people. November is a tipping point. Could you elaborate a little bit more on that one?
And what the release
sure.
period would be. I'm sorry, and what the release period would be.
Yeah, I gotcha. Okay, so the discussion now is about the tipping point in November and then the release period. Now, in our methodology, we've divided emotions into two large groups: building tension and release of tension emotions, and language matching thereof. The building tension everybody can identify as those kind of emotional responses that get your gut to knot up a bit and tighten up. Any physical body response to a sudden emotional state, good or bad, is building tension. A release thing is where your body lets go. For instance, in a happy yelling period at your favorite sports team is winning, you stand up and shout, your rib cage opens up, your diaphragm expands. That's a release moment because you're expressing emotion. So given that as a background, we have this thing where we have a summation of all these numeric values relative to any given aspect or attribute set in any given entity's collection of all its aspects and attribute sets. So basically it's a numeric sum for the emotional direction of the entity at various different levels. A tipping point occurs where all of the entities are sharing the same general direction, or excuse me, the same specific direction, and the same general rate of accretion of values at the same time. So in other words, for whatever reason, we were notified of the tipping point that occurred in 2001 within our data set some months ahead of time. We didn't know what the hell was going to go on, but I knew that after it occurred, life would not be the same. We have that same kind of situation right at the moment relative to November 8th through the 11th. I don't know what it's going to be, what the focus will be, but it is a tipping point in that my Terra entity, Space Goat Farts, Populous USA, Global, Press, even all the minor entities are all participating. And so, but this one is unique because it's a 4-day-long event or emotional plateau or actually emotional peaking, whereas within the 9/11 events, that was about several hours, I want to say about 16 hours of a peak before it went into release language. In other words, we were all extremely anxious for about 16 hours and then slowly started to relax a bit and release a little bit of emotion when we realized that there would not be any follow-up continuation. Here that event is going to last for 4 days according to our data, and then we're going to go into a release period that, unlike 9/11, the release period for 9/11 lasted about a week before we got back into building tension, and I think it was hardly a week or more before the Patriot Act and all this kind of stuff was circulating, and that probably accounted for a lot of the building tension that came so rapidly after the 9/11 event. In this case, we have a 4-day tipping point that goes from early in the morning on November 8th, runs all the way through to the like 11:45 p.m. on November 11th. And then we have a nearly 2-month-long release period that is sort of like the reverse of the tension period we're in at the moment. In the release period, it's like it's almost vertical downward. There's a slight angle. Maybe it gets out to 2% grade and then down to maybe 6% at its very end. And the end trails off in, like, I think on January 23rd or so. So it's going to be quite the ride. We don't know yet because the immediacy data is where we really find out the details that are trustworthy. You have to understand that the immediacy data and short-term data and long-term data all have different levels of granularity of the details. And the more details we have provides us a larger delta in the language from a previous time and gives us a higher level of confidence. So at this point, we just don't have much confidence in making a guess as to what it's going to be.
Any things about like a revisiting of something similar to the 1980s and then the early 1990s, but in a shorter time frame, especially regarding NASA and the Space Shuttle program? And are you getting any indications of volcanic activity?
Well, we're getting lots of indications of volcanic activity over the rest of this year, up to the point where it actually becomes something of an issue for both commercial and military planes in some very strategic spots, apparently, early next year. I want to say January, February timeframe. We don't have anything that is specific relative to NASA relative to the tipping point in November. There's a whole lot of stuff around the new electrics that emerges in October and is mixed in with the emotional run-up into the tipping point of November. So if we were specifically asking about that, I can't say that we have anything that specifically ties NASA into the tipping point period. However, we do have some really cool stuff pending because apparently NASA is going to get well, I don't know what, some kind of a inrush of emotional energy is going towards the whole issue of NASA as an organization. It should start in around May 15th, and then it also appears to peak around July 8th. Can't say what it is at this point, though. Could be, space aliens popping up, or it could be that they're going to fire a bunch of people and have an emotional brouhaha. either one would yield the same values that we have.
Well, Cliff, I have written down here for July 8th that date is significant with civil unrest, food prices skyrocketing, devaluation of the dollar. Now, could that July 8th be a precipice to the tipping point in November?
No, actually. You're correct. It's significant to a lot of those, all of those, but we have a crocodile tooth pattern plateau. I want to say a tabular iceberg-like structure that goes from July 8th all the way up to the tipping point. So we're still going to, in the aggregate, gain emotional tension, but on a daily basis we'll be up and down, up and down, up and down. It's just that every single day that we gain, the next day we might lose, but we won't lose quite as much as we gain. So the overall effect is about a 2 or 3% grade from July